Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone, for giving me a bit of your time this morning. I'm James Pomeroy. I'm a global economist at HSBC, and I'm going to spend about 15-20 minutes telling you, quite frankly, lots of things that could happen, but with very little concrete view of what will happen, because the number one overarching theme in the global economy today is uncertainty. So, what is happening in the world is an enormous amount of uncertainty. My first slide would show you essentially a huge amount of uncertainty. Everything can be as it looks until it's suddenly not. And the way I've been using this is the global economy going to fare exactly how I did when I ran the London Marathon? Which is that everything looks absolutely fantastic until you're getting into the Limehouse area and you step off a speed bump. Suddenly you pull a muscle, and suddenly everything doesn't look so great. And it's not just that everything can go wrong, it's more that everything can change. If you look at what's happened in the global economy in the last 3, 4, 5 years, it's been about those big jumps, those big shocks. So essentially we had the pandemic, we had the war in Ukraine, we've had all sorts of changes that have dramatically altered the global economy just like that. And essentially, will that happen this year? Will that happen on growth? Will that happen on inflation? Who knows? But we are dealing with a world where everything is unbelievably uncertain. We have a world today where it's almost impossible for us to know what is happening with the global economy because all the data is so confusing. You have consumer spending that's either looking absolutely fantastic or it's looking absolutely terrible, very much depending on who you speak to. So if you look at retailers, you look at durable goods, everything looks like it's slowing down. But if you look at other parts of the economy, you look at, hopefully, the leisure and hospitality sector, that's where we're all choosing to spend all of our money. Because in the post-pandemic era, there's clearly been a shift that this is exactly what everyone wants to do with their time, with their money. A huge boom in certain parts of the economy, in particular, in going out and having fun. Now, that has to be put in some sort of context because all of that together gives us this unbelievably uncertain global economic outlook. It also gives us a world where basically over the course of the next year, in aggregate, growth globally won't be fantastic. It will be largely flat, small percentage increases in growth on a quarter-to-quarter basis. But some things are winning, some things are losing. But within that, there is essentially three massive risks. There's a big downside risk, there's a big upside risk, and there is a very, very mixed bag risk. And essentially the big downside risk to me is that high interest rates hurt. And it seems to me that over the course of the last 6 months, economists and central bankers have been saying inflation's this huge problem, we need to keep raising interest rates to tackle inflation, and then shock, out of nowhere, everyone's realised that higher rates can have an impact on the economy, or on the financial system. And it's economics 101. You raise rates to slow down the economy. You raise rates to cause things to break, and then everyone seems magically surprised that stuff breaks. And stuff is breaking all over the place. We saw this, if anyone's been a crypto investor, you'll have very much felt that last year. If you own Swedish property, you'll have felt that over the last 6 months, or New Zealand property, down 17, 18%. What we're seeing in the developed world elsewhere, in the UK, in the US, is people just aren't selling homes. Because if you're in the US and you're very lucky and you've tied yourself into a lovely 30-year mortgage at 2 or 3%, you are not moving house. Because suddenly that 7% mortgage, if you do, is very, very prohibitive. So you see a big hit to real estate transactions. Then you've got a similar situation happening in the UK, where we have this glorious setup of fixed rate mortgages. And there'll be lots of people, no doubt some in this room, who are on a 2 or 5 year fix that just unfortunately elapses this year. I am one of those people because when I bought my house with my wife a couple years ago, I said to her, look, I'm an economist. We don't have many skills to bring the world, but one of them is interest rate forecasting. And my team tell me with 100% certainty that interest rates aren't going up in the UK. And lo and behold, here we are, when that letter comes through from Barclays to say your mortgage is getting renewed at a nice higher rate. That is an awkward conversation. But there's going to be many people around the country who are going to feel that shock in the course of this year. And that's going to squeeze consumer spending. It's going to squeeze incomes. It's going to squeeze what people can do. The problem is we just don't know by how much. So it's a hugely problematic impact on consumer spending from higher rates. And we just don't know how big that impact's going to be. But there's a big upside risk, and that's China. And China's reopening has been really, really good news for the rest of the world. when we put out our forecast at the end of last year, we were saying, okay, China's reopening, but let's just be careful here, because what's happening in China is you've got this flood of COVID cases through the economy. It's going to take a long time for people to want to go back out and spend. And we basically made exactly the same mistake we've made across the rest of the world, which is that we forgot that people absolutely love doing things. And so if anyone remembers back in July 2020 when everything opened back in the UK, I don't know if anyone went out that night, but it was like New Year's Eve and Christmas Eve rolled into one. I've never seen places busier. And yet what we've managed to do all the way through the pandemic is massively underestimate how quickly people want to get back out and do things. And unsurprisingly, that's exactly what's happened in China. People have just suddenly gone, we just want to get back out and do things. And there's been a big constraint here, which is essentially the number of flights. People can't get out of China because the airlines haven't got their flights back up and running. But what we're going to see this year is a huge boom in Chinese tourism across the world, firstly into Asia and then across the rest of the world. We've also got here in Europe, we had last year one of the best tourism seasons in history, and that was without any real tourists from Asia, because even Japan and Korea only opened up last spring, not enough time to plan long-haul travel. So you've got this huge wave of tourism spending coming from Asia in the course of this year, hugely, hugely optimistic. Then you've got this mixed bag risk, which is the labour market. And the labour market at the moment is crazy, in particular in the sector people in this room operate in. But what we've essentially had during the course of the last couple of years is the strongest labour market in history. Oh, here we go. I can shuffle through my slides very quickly. This is my marathon. Started well, went badly. Consumer spending's either good or great. This is where everyone's spending their money. Stuff looks all right. House prices are a problem. China's all right. And we're back here. Perfect. Right. What that's taught me is I could do the whole presentation in 2 minutes. But people have not been laid off at any sort of rate, so people are confident. And what do people do when they know they're not going to lose their job? They're willing to go out and spend. People love spending. You don't need to save for a rainy day if that rainy day is not going to appear. So people are not being laid off, people are quitting their jobs, but there is a slight sense that things could be turning, that we could see a drop-off in job openings. We could see a drop-off in employment growth. So there's a little bit of a potential slowdown in the labour market. That doesn't worry me too much yet. But this is the classic sort of situation where you can be an optimist or a pessimist, both at exactly the same time. You could look at this right-hand chart and say, oh, those job openings are coming down. That's pretty worrying. Or you could say the number of job openings is still miles higher than it was pre-pandemic. The labour market's fine. The problem is both of those things are true at exactly the same time, incredibly confusing way of trying to work out what's going to happen. But what is starting to happen is people are coming back into the labour force. And here in the UK, our Chancellor is desperately trying to do this. You'll have seen all the announcements, all of the essentially begging people to come back into the workforce. But the whole idea here is the way to get people back is pay them enough. And essentially what happened during the pandemic is people across all of the world, not just here in the UK, left the labour force because they either retired early or wanted to do education instead or found alternative jobs. And it's not surprising, supply and demand, you pay people more people want to work. And a combination of that plus dropping asset prices, a bit more uncertainty in the economy, appears to be bringing people back into the labour force, both here and in the US, and a good sign in terms of that labour supply hopefully starting to ease up. And that means that we're going to see slightly lower wage growth, because wages in the UK in particular have been rising very, very quickly, sort of 6, 7, 8% year on year in aggregate, and in some sectors, some skills, much, much stronger than that. But basically we had loads and loads of demand for workers and not much supply of workers. And that balance is coming back into place. And that's important because it changes bargaining power, changes the attitude towards wages. We still think wage growth is going to be quite high throughout this year, maybe next year because of inflation, but it is starting to come off from some of these intense pressures. Now, inflation more broadly though, things look good. And this is where the optimism comes out, because inflation has been a huge problem across the world over the course of the last couple of years, and suddenly things are starting to look better. Headline inflation rates across most of the world are peaking out. Core inflation, which excludes food and energy, is also peaking out, ever so slightly, but things are going in the right direction, and these numbers will come down. It's bold to make these sorts of forecasts given my interest rate fiasco, but inflation will come down during the course of this year, mostly because of commodity prices and base effects. Now, it's almost impossible for inflation to go higher because last year we had oil prices going up 60, 70%, we had natural gas prices doubling or tripling, we had food prices going up 50%. All of that has changed. And if we were all put together this time last year, shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine, and we were to say, where do you think the oil price will be in a year's time? Where do you think natural gas prices will be in a year's time? We would have said much, much higher. They are lower. And so what you're going to get in the course of this year is this base effect in inflation washing out, input costs for businesses falling quite quickly. Unfortunately, because of the way energy prices work in the UK, we won't see it in our own personal bills quite yet. That will come next year. But we will start to see input costs come down for businesses. So there's this very favourable cost pressures easing, very, very much better story in terms of input prices for businesses. But also, the best news is that supply chains have massively improved. And this was the other huge problem we were having last year, discussing with businesses saying, can you get enough stuff? No. Why? There's no containers. And it was that lack of containers to ship things across the world that was causing shortages throughout all sorts of sectors, pushing up prices and causing a huge amount of trouble. But essentially what's happened is some clever policy changes. The most important policy change of the last 2 years was that the Port of LA Long Beach started charging people $100 a day to keep an empty container in the port. And that's such an inconsequential thing, but it caused the whole world to change in terms of supply chains, because suddenly all those containers that had been sat empty in the US went back to China. We suddenly didn't have a container shortage. And again, this time last year, if I'd stood on this stage and said, well, I'm being super optimistic here, I think the cost of shipping could fall by 50% this year, people would have said that was impossible. People would have said, James, you're being way, way too optimistic. Well, I was wrong, because they fell by 95%. Because as soon as supply and demand come into balance, things change very, very quickly. And so what we've had happening over the course of the last 6 months is all of these supply chain problems ease up. And when stuff can flow, one, it's much, much cheaper for businesses, because all that inventory that they're running down now is being replaced at a much, much lower cost. Because it's costing you 95% less to ship things in from Asia or from anywhere else in the world. But also then it brings back competition. And during the course of the pandemic, we haven't had competition because of shortages. If you have stuff, you sell it for whatever you want to sell it at. Whereas now that's changing. And we've already seen it come through in the US, where this eased up quickest. You've seen the sharpest drop in goods prices in a long, long time. Actually, in history, over the course of the last 3 months, the sharpest drop in goods prices in history. And if that starts to spread to Europe and starts to spread to other products, we could see inflation come down much, much more quickly than anyone was expecting. The problem is that a lot of businesses have seen their costs go through the roof over the last year. The average company in Europe saw their input costs go up 45% last year. That's a problem, because suddenly they want to keep passing as much of that cost increase on further down the line. And if they want to keep their margins high, they want to try and grow them, then of course prices are going to keep rising, even as those input costs come down. So that's a big uncertainty. We have no idea how much almost profiteering or margin rebuilding companies are going to put in place throughout the supply chains. Much of that will come down to demand. If people keep spending, then that upward pressure on prices will continue. If we see a slowdown in spending, then inflation could drop very, very quickly. And as with everything in the global economy at the moment, it's almost impossible to tell you which one of those is going to happen. But it's an upside risk to inflation. There is also the upside risk from the services side of the economy. That's still where we have shortages. And that's because you can't switch from one thing to another. So one of my ways I like spending a lot of my money is going to watch Newcastle United. And Newcastle United tickets this year are like gold dust. And part of that is because they're having an amazing season. Part of it is because that's what everyone wants to spend their money on at the moment, going out and consuming leisure. Now, if I can't get tickets to Newcastle, I can't just go and buy tickets to watch Sunderland. It's just impossible. There's no way that could happen. So what you end up doing is you pay whatever it costs. The same is true with going to see musicians or comedy or shows. People are almost price insensitive at this point. And the same is true in certain other leisure activities. Now, the amount of people who I've spoken to in the last year who have said, my summer holiday is costing me far too much money this year. I'm sure many people in this room have had that discussion with their family. And I'm almost certain that almost every single person who's had that discussion booked that holiday and is going and is going to have a lovely time. Because we've become price insensitive to lots of things we missed out on during the pandemic. And that shortage of supply, massive demand, prices keep going higher. So in the services side of the economy, That's where we still have a lot of inflation. That's what central banks are worried about, and that's why interest rates keep going higher. So essentially, central banks would absolutely love it if we stopped having so much fun. So next time you hear Andrew Bailey speak, that's pretty much what he's telling you to do. Now, what does all of that mean for the economy? Well, where are interest rates going to go? The good news is we think that in the UK, the Bank of England is done in terms of rate increases. We think that there's a pretty good chance that they don't need to do any more. Now, some of that is because some of these inflation dynamics are improving. Wage growth starting to tick down, labour markets loosening up just a little bit, goods prices are coming down. But of course, remember my own mortgage situation, we can be wrong. There is an enormous amount of uncertainty. The problem is with interest rate forecasting at the moment is that some economists tell you rates need to go so much higher because inflation's still too high. Some will tell you interest rates need to go lower because of financial stability concerns in the banking sector, or the housing market, or wherever it needs to be. And the problem is that all of those views exist within the Bank of England. So you have 9 people voting on rates. They all choose to do different things. So it's a highly, highly uncertain environment. But we think given that macro backdrop, we're likely to be at or very close to peak interest rates here in the UK. What does this mean for the pound? Well, what's happening here in the UK is fine. Our economy is ticking along. It's not exactly booming, but it's not shrinking. And we've seen the pound strengthen against the dollar in the course of the last 6 months. Now, why has that happened? It's essentially because the world isn't ending, which isn't necessarily something that takes much to improve from. But if you go back to last September, the whole discussion we were having in these sorts of presentations was, will we see rolling blackouts in Europe? Now, that is a very, very pessimistic way to start a presentation. So simply not having rolling blackouts has strengthened all European currencies. So we were back at the parity against the dollar with the euro, and the pound was close to it, and everyone was saying we're going to go below parity in all of those discussions. But as soon as energy prices started falling, the worst was over for Europe, and the pound and the euro have strengthened. So we think we can keep going a little bit stronger, maybe about 130 against the dollar. What's going to happen to these other input costs? Well, shipping rates have collapsed already. That's good news, and we think they're going to keep moving slightly lower because supply is still high. What's going to happen to energy prices? Well, in the most economist forecast of all time, no idea. But simply, things look so much better today than they did 3 or 4 months ago. We have to be very, very grateful, I think, here in the UK to European governments' genuinely excellent ability at building up their gas storage levels, sorting out imports of LNG. All of those things have done a remarkable job of pulling down wholesale gas prices in Europe. Obviously, here in the UK, we don't have very much gas storage. So what happens if those prices go back up next year? Well, we have to pay more. So there's an element of volatility. And if you look at how to forecast energy prices, there's a lovely variable in there, which is called the weather. Which is even harder to forecast than anything else. So you've almost got this massive uncertainty out there with energy prices, particularly next winter. But the supply and demand imbalances look so much better. It seems unlikely we go back to the levels we saw last winter. So some good news on input costs for businesses, hopefully. Wage growth, as we said, should be coming down ever so slowly, just because of some balance restoring in the labour market. And finally, the most important question is, will people keep spending? And that will drive all of these other things. It will drive the overall shape of the economy. It will drive inflation. It will drive where interest rates go. I'm skeptical that people will keep spending, because if you were to say to an economist, I'm going to give you a world where interest rates have gone up 4% in a year. You look at a world where inflation is well above wage growth. You look at a world where things should theoretically be slowing down after a post-pandemic boom. You'd say, well, everything must be pretty weak, right? You must go into some sort of consumer recession. But we would have said that 9 months ago, 6 months ago, 3 months ago, and it hasn't quite happened. And so what we think will happen is you get this just continuation of spending, a rotation in spending. We'll all stop buying electronics and furniture and all of those things we stockpiled during the pandemic, and continue to spend a little bit more on leisure, having fun, and Andrew Bailey probably won't like that. Thank you very much.
That was terrific, James. Despite our best efforts at sabotage, you did brilliantly. I won't make that joke ever again, I promise. Very good. One of the things that occurred to me in what he said, that there's a lot of uncertainty, as usual. But some good news there for this hospitality sector, James, with this pent-up demand from so many parts of the world because of the restriction on flights. Do you have any sense of timing on that? Is there any?
In Asia, we see a lot more flights. We see a lot more flights coming online in really around Q2, Q3 out of China.
Great.
If you look at some of the data from Air China, they published the number of flights that are going. Domestic flights in China are now. Domestic flights in China are back at levels that we saw pre-pandemic around China, but international flights are currently running at about 10 to 15% of that volume. So that number is just going to keep rising and rising and rising in the course of the next few months. So those numbers in terms of Chinese tourists going across the world, particularly here in Europe, will continue to come through. The issue is that what we saw with Western reopening is short-haul travel came back really, really quickly, but long-haul travel took a bit longer, partly because the extra cost, extra planning in terms of those sorts of things, but also we had this slight problem where Europe reopened, but Asia didn't. So a lot of people were very, very reluctant to go to Thailand on holiday because you were worried that you could get there, but you may not be able to get home. Whereas actually you haven't got that same sort of problem in terms of Asian reopening. But we do think it will be basically a gradual story through this year and next year. Chinese tourism, Japanese tourism, Korean tourism, and to be honest, the rest of Asia, because one of the big structural stories I didn't mention in the presentation is you've got an amazing growth of middle-class consumers coming through in Asia at the moment. You've got still very young populations growing quickly, rapid income growth, and taste changing materially. And it's something we've done a body of work about. And if you're interested, please reach out and I can send it to you. And basically, we're saying across Asia, recreational spending almost can't grow, well, it has to grow at least 7% a year every year for the next 20 years in volume terms. It's almost impossible for it to be lower, just simply because of a combination of income growth and demographic changes. So that's where the tourists of the world are coming from. We just need to get the supply of flights up.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Would you mind sending that through anyway to Ufia? Maybe we could make it as part of the papers. That'd be great. Thank you, James. One other thing to encourage everybody to do is to ask James about the inherent conflict between the short-term world that he's described so eloquently and the need to invest for this sustainable future that we're also talking about today. And there is potentially an inherent conflict there that would be great to get your views on. So ask him about it in the coffee.